My name is Isaac Freck. I am a freshman and I'm majoring in political science and art history, and my presentation is on American film, Hollywood, and in the international media trade-off. So for intro, with film, we know like through the different countries, each country has a different perspective of lens through that they make their films, whether it be economic, political, social, whatever, it doesn't matter. And with these, they're able to trade off through popularity different techniques through plot, themes, devices, film techniques, anything in order to essentially influence the entire world and trade off parts of their own culture for the for other countries and other artists to use. So with American Hollywood, it would all start extremely early 1800s, 1880s even. Well, not early the 1880s, and they would start with the silent films because sound wouldn't have been invented, and the earliest films would be only about 5 to 10 minutes long. Some of the earliest being about 2 seconds long. And what this would do is this would start to bring an international focus on film itself and film media, and that would slowly gain popularity throughout the years, as well as other countries and the artists in them would see this and decide, let's take our turn at it and put our own perspective on what we as artists want to do. And this would also launch the career of of famous actors, Bela Lugosi and Charlie Chaplin, who would continue and continue and continue to inspire many other actors in their field for generations after their death. They would become inspirational head figures. This would also lead to a movement where we would see different stunt movements and coordination to pull off effects and trick the audience into thinking that what they were seeing was actually real. And so, really, if we're getting into the start of film would be the horse in motion. Now, this isn't technically really a film. It's more of a series of 8 pictures set up from 8 different cameras taking a picture simultaneously that created a film, you could say, that was about only maybe 2 seconds long. But what this would do is in France, this would inspire the creation of the first actual technical feature length movie, Round Hay Garden Scene, which is only about 2.11 seconds long. And that's not long, but what this movie would do through French director Louis Le Prince is that it would spark a whole revolution of making films and adapting other cultures into these films to create a sort of international culture behind film media and eventually digital media when animated films started being made in the 20s and 30s and stuff like that. Now I set this up by movies that I found most influential, the early influential movies from each country, and one of the first obviously is Dracula. Now, Universal started the craziness in the 1930s Hollywood with this movie, which obviously would inspire an enormous cultural background that would introduce audiences around the world to Dracula, inspire many other properties, TV shows, plays, movies, video games, comic book series, anything that would spread around the world and that would allow other people to see what America started. This was also launch different techniques in acting and method acting for how the main actors would portray their respective characters in the film. Now, another movie that I chose that was very influential and that would have a big influence on other films throughout the years was a very non-common film called Meshes of the Afternoon by Maya Deren. The basis of this film is to essentially explore the the internal mental experiences of people with disorders and diseases to see what they go through on sort of daily basis, how events seem to repeat themselves to each other and to them, and how everything seems to be so foreign and almost like euphoric. Now, what this would do with Maya Deren is she would start a complete revolution of using camera angles. She would create such thing as superimposed cuts, jump cut, slow motion, all to a really kind of percussive kind of sound. And essentially, what she would, even though it's a very experimental film, it is still highly regarded because of her use of the camera angles and including her husband. And what it would do for later influences would be essentially like inspiring uh inspiring like almost a revolution of being able to create these more avant-garde kind of weird wacky films that people like David Lynch would make with Eraserhead and all his other films. And then now we're going to go on to other countries. I've started with only some of the most influential, one of them being Japan, which had an insanely big cultural influence on us, and we had a big cultural influence back on them, which a lot of their early films from the 50s, 60s, 40s would be inspired by our American film works. A lot of their samurai films took inspiration and sometimes almost directly even copied most of our typical normal spaghetti western cowboy films that we would show. And what this would do for them is give uh, directors the ability to kind of experiment with our template to create something that they know their own people would be able to relate to in a way that they could express themselves, which um, they also did a lot of engineering in their own I mean, not political, pop culture, which would eventually spread all over the world with different properties and even lead to some of the largest created movies and, and series in the entire world that even today are still extremely prevalent to most people. Now, I started with this film, The Hidden Fortress, for Japan because although it's not very well known, it is the main basis for the Star Wars series, and more importantly, the first Star Wars movie, or the fourth, and parts of the video game Final Fantasy 12. Now what George Lucas would do when he would take director Akira Kurosawa's bit plot points and use the basis of his two main characters for two of the protagonists in his own film, making a sort of rip off, not entirely rip off, but a homage to Kurosawa in his works in his own regard that would obviously, as we know today, blow up and become such a political giant in our international media. I mean, it's Star Wars is literally over everywhere in every country. Everyone knows about it. Tons of people love it, and it's such a beloved series that really the main basis for it came from Japan. If that's crazy to believe, Japan really gave us, gave the U.S. and more importantly George Lucas the template inspiration for the film. So already we see that for international culture and media trade, that some really small film that most people might not know about inspired one of the great giant series of American and international pop culture in the past 40, 50 years. Now, another that's also good to talk about from Japan, it's again very notable, would be Godzilla. Now, originally, Godzilla started off as a more post war and anti American film that would show how vulnerable Japan was at the time when we dropped the bombs and how it portrayed us as like an evil giant that brought needless and horrible destruction to their land. And in regards to work, the movie itself does make that obvious with its various points and how vulnerable they are to to the title character Godzilla, with being almost helpless in the wake of it, which can be compared to the nuclear bombs dropped on Japan that would eventually lead to the end of World War II. But at the same time, it doubled as a way for the world, just like with the alternative of Japan giving the inspiration for Star Wars, for the world to take on this huge giant that blew up and essentially give credit to them and make an entire huge series based off this one movie. And surprisingly, it's anti-Americanism, which surprises me a lot that it still was made, even though it's based off a very thematic movie with obvious points of hurt and pain. Now, Russia, I chose one film because even though get with the situation with Ukraine right now, they do cement themselves in history. Not with many films; they're very limited. But one of the best ended up internationally with America and all countries in film and media, giving us a very broad use of our camera and technique in film in order to create different scenarios, scenes, and present moments in a different way, which would span from a little propaganda film, which is the Battleship Potemkin. Sorry if I butchered that, but what the director Sergei Einstein would do with this, other than making it a very big propaganda film for its time, would be it was used for his study of montage, which would be prevalent in its fourth act, The Odessa Steps, where clearly throughout its different scenes, the camera cuts from one thing to another scene to another scene to another scene in equal succession of each other in order to bring in an emotional impact and show what the essentially the antagonists, or you could say protagonists in some ways, of the film were doing to the people on the Odessa Steps by showing the amount of death, damage, carnage, chaos they were able to cause throughout that short part of the film. Now, what this would do, wouldn't trade off with America, is once people saw the ideas of montage and its experiments, obviously, as we can see today, it would be very well grafted in the other films, with many filmmakers choosing to take the same route of using those quick jump shots from part to part to part in certain scenes to highlight different moments, whether sad, angry, or to highlight the chaos and destruction or the beauty of their intended movie. Now, for my last country, I chose Spain. Spain has a lot of influential films, mainly in my own opinion in the horror genre, with their special effects. And one of the early films that I watched that I don't cover in here is a little short movie called La Barbe, where essentially the Spanish were able to set up a mirror and have different images playing at the same time in front of a man sitting in front of it. And this was in the 1930s, and they would evolutionize how to use special effects to their own will and create these kind of euphoric, almost transcending pieces of film. And again, we can see that with some of Guillermo del Toro's work with Pan's Labyrinth and all of his very supernatural films that take on their own use of special effects and still bring a level of fear and otherworldliness to them when we see them. Now, the movie I chose for Spain was Un Nandalo, which was by renowned surrealist painter Salvador Dali and Luz Buñuel. Now, really, in all honesty, this film does not make sense at all. There's nothing, and it's even quoted by the people who made it that anything in the film that you see can't relate to anything in the real world. There is no meaning. There is no actual like plot themes or whatever. It is supposed to be just you sit down and watch it and wonder what exactly you just experienced. There's no plot. There's nothing. Now, what would this do? Well, this would be inspired by again the Russian movie, the Battleship Potemkin, and what this short 17-minute movie template would do was it would actually inspire the entire music video. Well, it's been credited to inspire the template for music videos, as it would really not have any linear sort of plot zigzagged all over the place. The movie has like cars that go from 2 weeks later to 8 years in the past to the present. Not a whole lot of sense, but this you could see it in the way music videos are filmed. There's no real like in early ones. There's no real plot. There's no real meaning. There's no real method. It's just this performer in front of the camera performing the song as the camera zips around to different areas and stuff. There's no real meaning, which can all be attributed to this little 17-minute surrealist film from the 1920s. Now, in the outlook, the overall takeaway, we can see that from America's beginnings of the film, from a small, really not even sort of film of a horse running, filmed in California, to basically inspiring other countries to take on the same kind of thing and create their own media empires, which would spill into the whole world and the dynamics of other countries and inspire them to create their own sort of things, taking inspiration, homage, and techniques, everything for them to use. And and coming back to international relations, we can see that even from now with the Academy Awards and the Oscars and stuff, we include foreign films, because really it's all a cultural trade-off. America may have started the beginnings of film, but it wouldn't be where it is today without other countries adapting the media into their own ways and visions and creating what they wanted to create at the time with these early films that would stay prevalent to now, even with different outlets in pop culture and media, whether it's through art, film, music, whatever. It doesn't really matter. All these examples in these countries, what they did was create a giant network of international trade through culture that would that can be used to criticize governments, economics, policies, the world, whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters most is that other countries are influencing each other to make these films in order to grow and, as a world, come together as a giant cultural mixing pot. And that is my